Senior figures in the Labour Party really enjoy a certain turn of phrase whenever they talk about their shift to the right and their refusal to listen to protesters when confronted by them. And it always goes something like,
"This is a changed Labour Party that represents working people, not a party of protest."
Frankly, the only response I really have to that is this.
What an odd thing to say.
Because it is an odd thing to say, isn't it? There's a lot going on in the phrase, "we're no longer a party of protest," especially when it's juxtaposed with representing working people and linked to the idea that their party has changed, which raises questions. Why do they feel the need to draw this distinction? And why is this a direct response to a protester in the case I showed you all earlier? I also think that this distancing from protest had and continues to have consequences, both in terms of policies pursued and, to some extent, the stability of the UK. Now, don't worry, we're not about to descend into the much less cool version of anarchy, but it's hard to look at the UK as it stands and say anything other than it's meta-stable, where we're under the illusion that we're in a stable position that is the lowest it can possibly go, but there is in fact much lower we can go. The consequences are also illuminated by what protest is meant to do inside the liberal democratic framework. The current UK government probably would say that it operates within that framework, shutting it all off and signaling that it's pointless, or saying that you want nothing to do with the cause of protesters, no matter what they believe, or perhaps because of what they believe given the protests that we see in the UK, then you're not leaving a lot of people many options to express their discontent. Which, you know, when a deeply unpopular political class insulates themselves from public opinion and imposes their will upon that public, it famously only ends well. I'm going to throw down some predictions at this point in the video. One of two things are almost certainly going to happen. Either Keir Starmer is going to resign before the next general election, or, and possibly I don't know if these two will go together necessarily, but Labour are going to suffer the worst or second worst defeat for a government since universal suffrage. We can debate whether these things are deserved or just, or will render the UK ungovernable while probably handing it to a fascist party, but I do think the probability distribution is that one or both of these things are going to happen. When these things happen, there will be lots of analysis in the press, as there should be, because either of these things happening would be a remarkable thing to happen to a party that just won a landslide at the last election. A lot of that coverage from the press will take a sympathetic tone, saying something along the lines of, well, this happened because the government was dealt a terrible hand and no one could have done a good job. We will be presented with the notion that to govern the UK well at this moment in time was beyond anyone's capability, which I feel like I don't need to tell you is total bullshit. They'll also scapegoat the usual suspects, the left, but that's table stakes. We don't need to get into that. We all already understand this, and I don't think that I need to explain that in great detail. I think that the sense of doom around the government, and the reason why I think this government is going to fail, are rooted in part in this attitude towards protest, because protest is actually a useful tool for a government if it wants it to be. Of course, if your interest is less in governing well or according to the needs of the public, but is instead ideological purity, then protest is something you don't associate yourself with, as Labour have insisted on doing. Let's ask the basic question. What's the point of protest? There are a number of ways and perspectives from which to answer this. For example, for most of the people watching this video, we could answer this question with protests are both an expression of and a vector for organising around a specific issue. We see a genocide in Palestine, supported by a government, so we go out in the streets to demonstrate that there's substantial public opinion that can be mobilized against that in the hopes that the government stops supporting that genocide. I know that it hasn't worked, but it's still frustrating to have to say it out loud. Apologies for the abrupt break. The police decided to drive by. Has this worked? Well, that's kind of going to be related to a point that I make later, but protests manifest on several issues across different segments of society. So clearly some aspect of this works in some way, or people really need to get out of the house and it gives them an excuse. I'm kidding, but also, it's good to get out of the house sometimes. The perspective I actually want to think about is, what does protest do within a political system like the one the UK likes to think it has, that of a competitive, multi-party democracy? Yeah, look, I don't really believe this is the case, but it is the self-image of the UK. In that system, protests are a way for discontent to be voiced and acted upon in peaceful ways. It allows people who are discontent with specific issues, or are generally just sort of broad issue reformists, to act upon their beliefs in a way that could feasibly convince the government or other elected politicians to take up their cause, or at least throw them some kind of concession. It's a pressure release, with the freedom to protest, but crucially, without the guarantee that it will actually be effective. Sure, public opinion might galvanize around an issue, but like the anti-Iraq War protests in the UK, there's a good chance that they'll fail in their goal, and that at the next election, the party responsible for the war wins their third election in a row, while the largest swings against them are against MPs who voted to oppose that war. So in that case, protests likely hurt the politicians who actually supported the cause of the protests, and that energy dispersed. Now, it never really went away, but with the war ongoing and no real appetite for a campaign around withdrawal, it no longer animated people the same way. The pressure was released. You can't account for consequences down the line, but in the short and medium term, the political class mostly got what they wanted. Governments might see big protests for reforming the House of Lords. I know we don't have those, but let's imagine and use that as an excuse to track public opinion, and do that. It's the best of all worlds. The public is reassured that we live in a democratic society where protest matters, and the government gets to do what it already wanted to do, but maybe lacked the political will, capital, or bravery to pursue. Whether you like that or not, from the perspective of the government, of the political class, this is an incredibly stabilizing thing to have in your society. It's incredibly unlikely for protests about saving a local park to escalate into nationwide protests. I mean, that example is a bad one because that has happened somewhere, but usually, and this is why it happened in that case, usually escalates because of abuse by the police or other security measures. From that perspective, it's certainly better than protesters breaking into your house and beating you to death in front of your crying family because you refuse to reduce VAT on penguin bars. I'm gonna be completely transparent here. It was like 1 a.m. when I wrote that line, and I think I was just hungry at the time and annoyed that no shops were open. But, I would like cheaper penguin bars, please. Let's get back on track and away from my late night hunger. Protests manifest in different ways depending on the specific goal, the specific issue, the urgency or the perceived urgency, I suppose, who the protest intends to pressure, and how. The way to pressure a government is different from how you would pressure someone renting factory space to an Israeli arms company, for example. That all shows in the variety of tactics that we see. An anti-fracking protest might focus on impeding the actual fracking by blocking access to a site. A pro-Palestine protest will march from A to B in order to demonstrate to the government the depth of political support. Protesters who want to highlight the issue of climate change will glue themselves to things in museums or throw soup on paintings. We might agree, disagree, think that these are productive or not. Regardless, these tactics are aimed at galvanizing different responses because the contours of the issues are different. Though, now that I think about it, two of my examples are actually pretty directly tied together, but they're addressing different aspects and scales of the same issues. So it's about the urgency in what levers people think that they have available to themselves to pull. From the perspective of political parties, governments, whoever's in charge or trying to be in charge, protest has a function beyond being a pressure release. It's a way for politicians to get a sense of which way the wind is blowing on an issue or associate themselves with a cause they think is popular. You might be thinking, well, that's awfully cynical. What a horribly cynical way to think. And you're right. You need only look at Labour's campaigning alongside the WASPy women who are fighting for compensation due to some pensions fuckery that we really don't have the time to get into right now, but Labour campaigned alongside them and then betrayed them. They saw the sympathy their cause had garnered, associated themselves with it, and then did sweet fuck all about it when they had the chance because of the fiscal rules. That all being the case, they weren't against that form of protest on that issue, were they? Even the so-called changed Labour Party still used protests as a way to navigate the political landscape. You also saw this with those farmers' protests we had in the UK about farmers being angry about having to pay half the rate of inheritance tax that everyone else has to pay, which is a whole thing, and I'm pretty unsympathetic overall. Nonetheless, there's a reason several opposition politicians showed up to that, including Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch, and Ed Davey seemingly taking a break from his midlife crisis that he had during the election. Now, I'm not suggesting that they're totally cynical in this, but they have clearly sensed this is an issue the government have opened themselves up on and are associating themselves with it. Presumably they either already agreed with the farmers or are adapting policy to meet some of their demands. Incidentally, giving the farmers who have taken to harassing Keir Starmer by playing Darude Sandstorm with air horns at him. Another outlet beside that, which is they now have a variety of parties to potentially vote for to achieve their policy objectives. There's no need for the farmers to escalate beyond being very loud and annoying, which we might not like and we might not agree with them, but it does speak to why protest is generally allowed. It's a stabilizing thing to have, and if we're going to get into some deeper thinking, it's better for things to be stable if you want to enable capital accumulation. So this is why liberal democracies tolerate it. Plus, having protests that don't immediately result in skulls being cracked on the streets implies a pluralism and a belief that the political system can respond to pressure that's healthy and, again, stable. I know it's a bit counterintuitive to see farmers blocking the streets or big marches in London and say, that's a sign of an incredibly stable society, but it really is. It gives opposition groups both a way to vent and use up some of their energy, and it suggests that there are peaceful and political means to achieve their goals, especially if politicians pay attention to them, show up to them, support them, that kind of thing. In essence, what I'm saying is to understand the point of protest from the perspective of a government invested in defending at least some portion of the status quo, never mind the amount that the current UK government is seeking to defend, which is pretty much all of it, but another video. What would you rather opposition groups were doing? Making a nuisance of themselves, marching from point A to B, generally being non-violent, if a little loud sometimes, and handing out leaflets? Or do you want them to be doing other, more kinetic things? I'm not even making a judgment on which of these things would be more effective, but generally things spiral once we're onto the kinetic options. If all of this is true, then why were statements like Rachel Reeves that I showed you earlier so common in the Labour Party. Part of it is thematic, and I know it sounds like I'm talking about a film or a TV show, perhaps reflecting how politics itself has become an entertainment product. But that doesn't mean it's not true, though. We should understand this distaste for protest in the context of a political project that is both seeking to distinguish itself from and repudiate the project of the previous leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, who everything is apparently about, but who throughout his career has been associated with almost every progressive protest movement that's existed. Rightly or wrongly, after the 2019 election, there was a sense that the vibes were off with him, and part of it was that he was associated more with protest, and that protest contradicted a desire to hold power. Now, I happen to believe it was his association with a specific type of protest, particularly anti-war and pro-Palestine protests, that these people think created this vibe. Setting that aside, because it really belongs in another video, and, I'm just really not in the mood for it, but if you think that a significant contributing factor to Labour's loss in 2019 was this association with protest, and that it's mutually exclusive with power, then it's only natural to want to signal your distance from it, because then you'll look more grown up. It's a lot like the difficult decision stuff I talked about in the last video, in that it's not really anything more than cargo cultism, since these people don't think any government has ever associated itself with protest, and a justification to wield power against the weak. There's also the simple fact that if you look at major protest movements in the UK over the past 25 years, they just don't agree with them. And they're, to borrow a phrase, choosing ideological purity over pragmatic politics. Fundamentally, for some of these politicians in Labour, it's about getting revenge on the people who called the Iraq War correctly. This creates a distance between them and protest movements, which is what they want, so mission accomplished, I guess, but this closes off certain things. For example, when people do things like run over protesters, as has been happening in the UK, it means the government doesn't defend the protesters, who are clearly in the right, because running people over is an awful thing to do. And we could talk for a long time about where the atmosphere that allows someone to ram protesters in a van with their own phone number on it comes from. I'll keep it short though. It's a combination of press hysteria, the way senior politicians deride protest, and the implications made about protesters. For example, it's all, what if an ambulance needs to get past them? Which, funnily, we didn't say about the farmers blocking roads. Weird how that works, isn't it? Or the ridiculous position that the pro-Palestine protests in the UK are somehow a hotbed of radical Islamism or anti-Semitism, which becomes a feedback loop. The more they distance themselves from protest, the harder the press pushed on the issue, the more they distanced themselves, and all of this resulted in anti-protest laws brought in by the Conservatives being passed without much resistance, and Labour not repealing them, even though it'd be trivial with the massive majority they have. There's a purpose for this beyond simply hating the former leader and mutually radicalising with the British press. It's not gone unnoticed that the Labour Party seems to really enjoy implementing Conservative Party policy. In fact, here's a clip of Wes Streeting, once again the AI-generated health minister, rubbing it in that they're doing Tory policy.
It must be so painful for the Conservative Party. It must be so painful watching a Labour government doing the things that they only ever talked about, reducing the size of bloated state bureaucracy, investing in defence, reforming our public services, bringing down the welfare bill. The public are asking, what is the point of the Conservative Party? I bet they're glad they chose change with Labour.
Yeah, I bet they're really upset about it, Wes. Wow, you sure got them. but this has led to the observation by more and more people that Westminster operates largely as a uniparty system where we have different parties on paper, but they're effectively acting as one. Most people making this observation will include Labour and the Conservatives in that. I'd go further and say it goes from the Lib Dems as its moderate wing to Reform as its far right wing. That detail isn't especially important in relation to what this has to do with protest and Labour distancing themselves from it, but I think it's important to remember generally the distinction that Labour sought to make between its current iteration and the previous one in part involved demonstrating that it was willing to play the game, so to speak, which has unkindly, though perhaps not inaccurately, led to the characterization that British elections are about who is the most effective Tory party, which, given what Wes Streeting was saying in that clip, is kind of difficult to dispute. The justification for this integration into the uniparty was that the previous leaderships of Labour were seen as too destabilising because they were too radical, which is to say their political instincts didn't perfectly line up with the incipient uniparty we have now at Westminster, which, I'll be honest, given what actually happened, is very funny. Since the UK is notoriously politically unstable, plus Starmer campaigned on change being stability, which doesn't make sense, but the fact he had to say it says something, I think. Protest, while it is stabilising, does undermine the interests of the uniparty that's developed. It gives public space to political alternatives, policy alternatives, implies some of the public don't agree with them. So the price of membership for Labour has been that they almost need to be seen as the most performatively anti-protest. I've mentioned that this anti-protest positioning is part of the reason that they'll lose or Starmer will resign, and this is probably the biggest vector for it. By doing this to become part of the uniparty, they've misunderstood where their electoral base is in relation to it. See, the Tories, Reform, the Lib Dems to a lesser extent, their existing electorates have an interest in the political status quo. So membership of the uniparty and its consequences are a limited risk. Labour, despite getting fewer votes than 2019, inherited a lot of that support. An overwhelming portion of its voters voted for them in 2019. A lot of their interests diverged from the uniparties, and so this anti-protest position they've had to adopt is going to share off a lot of their support. And while the alternative isn't obvious right now, I mean, it could be just staying at home, but suppose there is an alternative, much like in Scotland, the alternative may not be obvious until it is. I do believe that this anti-protest position is being taken preemptively to delegitimize and crush dissent on their own side, to be really oversimplistic with that. If the way they run the parliamentary party is any indication, with critical MPs prevented from questioning the leadership, then it's hard to imagine this authoritarian streak not motivating the "we're no longer a party of protest" sloganeering. The belief that seems to permeate this iteration of Labour is that the uniparty suits them because when given a choice between the really evil guys and the less evil guys, the public will pick the lesser evil. This isn't really working anymore, or at least not as effectively as it used to, so the need now is for political options to be as narrow as possible, especially as things get worse. So crushing dissent both within the party and without works. I hate to put it like that, but it just does. It serves a cynical purpose, or to be more accurate, it works until it doesn't. Like fixing everything with duct tape or WD-40, depending on which engineering dilemma you're confronting. Really, though, I think the main reason they say this and act like this is because fundamentally, the government we have now in the UK doesn't believe that mass participation in politics is legitimate. That goes for both within their own party, where they've changed rules to marginalize their own members, which, why would you be a member of an organization that does that to you? And it's very cool, by the way, totally not a sign that the whole point of your project is to undermine democratic structures. Just nothing to worry about there. As a governing project, you can see that they behave the same way. People who protest across a range of subjects are ignored. Now, whether you think that's right or wrong, we can argue about that, obviously, and on an issue-by-issue basis, because not all protests are created equal. You can see this continued crackdown on protests, especially around the prosecution of members of Just Stop Oil, who have also been the target of press ire. Look, there's no real long-winded explanation here across this class of people, across party political lines. They just think regular people are an impediment to grown-up politics. That's it. That's probably 90% of all of this, to be honest. They resent having to get the consent of any section of the public and are just wishing that that didn't have to happen. It's why during the election there was so much focus on one independent candidate, and afterwards a losing candidate got to do a massive crybaby tour on TV, which I did do a great video about. All of this focus on a, let's be honest, very marginal expression of an alternative political pathway that has quite a hard ceiling, while they were losing popularity, speaks to the priorities at play. They just don't want the wrong people spoiling their fun. Why is this ultimately going to be futile and ironically remove the changed Labour Party from power? Insulating yourself from public opinion to this extent is only a short-term solution. You can maybe do this to some groups, but not all of them, as Labour seems to want to do. Basically, you need someone to actually support you when shit hits the fan, and no one does. No one supports Labour. When all your support is soft, then it can't be surprising if they totally melt away. Now, I'm not saying that'll definitely happen. As the Canadian Liberals have shown recently, it can take surprisingly little in the right circumstances to resurrect your political prospects. Even so, the Canadian Liberals had a bench that was deeper than Labour, and they actually appear to have responded to some public pressure, whether rightly or wrongly. Again, we can argue about it. Labour will steadfastly refuse to respond to public pressure because, in part, they think it's childish to respond to public pressure, but also in part because any program that actually meets the demands of some segments of the public will look like the platform they're trying to repudiate. So they'll keep backing themselves into corners where the only solution is to double down on existing government policy left to them by the previous government. A platform that caused the most successful electoral political party in the West to lose half of its vote share. Now, this is speculation on my part, but I don't think people's problems with the Tories was that it was the Tories doing the damage. It was the damage. The worst part of all of this, from the government's perspective, and the best part of it for YouTubers who make very long videos about Keir Starmer, is resentments are going to be allowed to fester, and an already fractured political environment might shatter into pieces. Again, I don't like to speculate, but we're in an environment where direct action on some issues is already happening, with the press and some senior politicians deliberately slandering and inciting against protesters, and protest as a concept. It all has the tension that is trending towards potential escalation. Either a purely political one, where we see an even more absurdly divided electorate and party political landscape, or something else. And if it's something else, then suddenly a secret third thing enters the mix for my predictions. But for now, let's leave it there. Accept that protest is good actually and can form the basis of a meaningful program for wielding political power. And I'll catch you all in the next one. I need to thank Emir, who will have, he hasn't yet as of recording, made the thumbnail for this video, so thank you to him. and my proofreader, who had some fantastic notes about my midnight snacking issue, so thank you to her. And I need to shout out the patrons and members, but before I do, remember, if you really want to support the channel, like, comment, subscribe, those are the free options. And if you really, really like the channel, head on over to patreon.com/SKTheCrusader or become a member on YouTube. And hey, if you're at the top tier on Patreon, you even get a cheeky shout out like these people: Drone Riff, Mercutio, John N, and Liron. They are absolute legends. Thank you to them, and to the YouTube members Nadijiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Scaly Bubble, and Ben Johnson. With that, everyone, I hope you all enjoyed the video. I will catch you all on the next one, which may be coming sooner than you think. Ooh, I know. Mysterious, isn't it? Peace, everyone.